Welcome. We discuss the following topic. Examination of goods by buyer, Article 38, breach of contract. Remedy by seller, Article 48, avoidance. Taking delivery, Article 60, seller's remedies for breach of contract by the buyer. Examination of goods by buyer, Article 38. The buyer must examine the goods, or cause them to be examined, within as short a period as is practicable in the circumstances. If the contract involves carriage of the goods, examination may be deferred until after the goods have arrived at their destination. If goods have to be dispatched immediately by the buyer, then the same can be examined at the next destination. Third-party claim and right, Article 41 and 42. The seller must deliver goods which are free from any right or claim of a third party, unless the buyer agreed to take the goods subject to that right or claim. However, if such right or claim is based on industrial property or other intellectual property, the seller's obligation is governed by Article 42. Intellectual property. Intellectual property is any product of the human intellect that the law protects from unauthorized use by others. Intellectual property is traditionally comprised of three categories: patent, copyright, and trademark. The seller has the obligation of delivering the goods to the buyer which are free from any claim of a third party based on industrial or intellectual property. However, if the goods are subject to such claim, then the buyer must have agreed to receive such goods. Article 42. Breach of contract. A breach of contract committed by one of the parties is fundamental if it results in such determinant to the other party as substantially to deprive him of what he is entitled to expect under the contract, unless the party in breach did not foresee and a reasonable person of the same kind in the same circumstances would not have foreseen such a result. Article 25. Remedies for breach of contract by the seller. The buyer has the following remedies: performance, avoidance of contract, and reduction of price in case of non-conformity. Performance, Article 46. A. The buyer can require performance by the seller unless the buyer has resorted to an inconsistent remedy. B. The buyer may fix an additional period of time of reasonable length for performance by the seller of his obligations. Article 47. Non-conformity of goods, Article 46. If the goods do not conform to the contract, the buyer may require delivery of substitute goods. If the goods do not conform to the contract, the buyer may require the seller to remedy the lack of conformity by repair. Remedy by seller, Article 48. The seller may, even after the date for delivery, remedy at his own expense any failure to perform his obligations, if he can do so without unreasonable delay and without causing the buyer unreasonable inconvenience or uncertainty. However, the buyer retains any right to claim damages as provided for in this convention. The seller can do the above by sending notice to the buyer as a request to let him know whether late performance would be acceptable. Early and excess delivery by seller, Article 52. If the seller delivers the goods before the date fixed, the buyer may take delivery or refuse to take delivery. If the seller delivers a quantity of goods greater than that provided for in the contract, the buyer may take delivery or refuse to take delivery of the excess quantity. Avoidance. Avoidance can be declared by the buyer if a. Notice of avoidance given to other party, Article 24. B. Failure to performance by seller constitutes fundamental breach of contract, Article 51. C. Non-delivery of goods by the seller, Article 49. Reduction of price. Buyer is entitled to reduce price in proportion to the lack of conformity of goods. The above remedy can be exercised if the seller does not correct the non-conformity of goods or this correction is not accepted by the buyer. Obligation of buyer. The buyer must pay the price for the goods and take delivery of them as required by the contract. Article 53. The buyer's obligation to pay the price includes taking such steps and complying with such formalities as may be required under the contract. Article 54. If parties concluded the contract without determining the price, then the parties are deemed to have concluded the price which is generally charged at the time of conclusion of contract. Article 55. If the price is fixed according to the weight of the goods, in case of doubt it is to be determined by the net weight. Article 56. If the place of payment of price has not been specified in the contract, then a. Price will be paid at seller's place of business, or a. If the payment is to be made at the time of handing over the goods and documents, then the place and time when goods and documents are handed over. Taking delivery, Article 60. The buyer's obligation to take delivery consists a. In doing all the acts which could reasonably be expected of him in order to enable the seller to make delivery, and b. In taking over the goods. Thanks for watching.